Hey everyone, Tactics here, and with 10.2 finally confirmed to release on November 7th, I figured now would be a good time to go over all of that juicy new tank loot available in the patch, including interesting weapons with effects, new embellishments, very rare items, and of course, trinkets. Remember, this is on the PTR server, so everything is subject to change before the season actually does go live. I'll just be going through my experience with these various items so far during that testing. Now, just a quick reminder here before getting into everything, I will be putting out Mythic Plus guides for all 8 of the Season 3 dungeons, just like I did for Season 1 and for Season 2, and I'll also be putting out raid guides for normal, heroic, and mythic difficulty, so make sure you guys are subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss when those get posted. Now, let's get into all of the good stuff here, and we're going to start off with weapons. So actually, there is something available to every tank spec in terms of special weapons this patch. Of course, Blood DKs are going to be able to get their hands on that legendary two-handed axe. We're not 100% sure how this is obtained yet, what that entails. There's like one quest out of mind, so not sure if it's going to be similar to the Evoker legendary or something else entirely. Weren't able to test this, of course, so we don't know what the effect is either, but it's a legendary. It's gotta be pretty good, so Blood DKs are for sure happy. Moving away from Blood DKs here, where there is an Agi Fist weapon available. This is from the raid. Deals a bunch of extra nature damage. It is a unique weapon, so you can only get one of these. You don't need to dual wield or anything like that, but pretty solid weapon available to both Vengeance Demon Hunters as well as Brewmaster Monks if they want to use a dual wield fist weapons there. Also from the raid are a couple of Shadow Flame weapons. So we've got a Strength one-handed axe here, and it has the ability to deal additional Shadow Flame damage both to you and your target, which deals additional damage above 90% health, and basically the exact same effect here on an agility polearm. So Brewmaster Monks again have that kind of flexibility. Do I want to use a two-hander, or do I want to maybe use a one-hander with an effect and then just an extra one-hander? Either is available to them, which is nice. I actually do wonder if maybe you would run like both of these one-handers, even though you don't get the strength value as a Vengeance Demon Hunter or as a Brewmaster Monk, just because the effects are pretty powerful damage wise. So be interesting to see if like this is a setup you run and you just say, hey, I don't care about losing 360 or whatever it is agility. I'm down to just have this bonus damage effect. It seems like something tanks might do, so keep an eye out for that. There's also a one-handed strength weapon that comes from Waycrest Manor, of course one of the dungeons available in this season. Let's go over to it. I believe it's from the Pigman. Here it is, yeah. So it's no secondary stats, but it has this bleed effect on it as well. So still a interesting weapon that you can grab from dungeons, whereas everything else, weapon-wise at least, is coming from raids. Next up, let's talk very rare items and embellishments. There's really only one non-trinket very rare item worth mentioning here. So let's go in. It is a neck piece here from the third boss or fourth boss of the raid, depending. Basically just crit verse stats here, heavy verse, and your fire damage grants you a nature shield, and your nature damage grants you a fire shield on a 1-minute cooldown. Now this wasn't available for testing, so we don't know if those two shields like share a 1-minute cooldown or if each one has a 1-minute cooldown. Obviously, you're gonna have to be able to do the type of damage to proc the shield, which for most things is actually pretty easy, right? Shadow Flame damage is available to pretty much everyone relatively easily, and that's going to proc that fire effect most likely. Nature damage is maybe a bit more of a question mark, but you've got things like the Embellishments, Toxic Thorn Boots. You've got this fist weapon as an example that can proc that, so potentially not too hard for certain classes to proc, but in general, this feels like something that's going to be more beneficial to like a DPS player or a healer. Not the biggest deal for tanks, just because you have to also be taking that kind of damage, which I think there's some dungeons where you are going to be taking some decent amount of nature damage specifically, but on a 1-minute cooldown and given the size of the shield, it doesn't seem like a big deal, more just like an added little benefit here. In terms of embellishments, there is one pretty interesting one here. I believe it's from Tindril. Yeah, here it is, the Flourishing Dream Helm. So this is a plate helmet here. It's got crit verse on it, and basically taking damage has a chance to cause a slumbering dream to flourish. It shields you for 15 seconds, and it marks an ally within 30 yards, and basically if you move within 5 yards of that ally, they also get a smaller shield. While this is pure defensive, the shield values kind of go crazy. I think I have a Wowhead page open here. So at like 470 here, This is like a 120k shield on yourself and like a 80k shield on your ally, right? And this will go up to 483, I want to say. That sounds right. Like a low 480s. So this effect goes up pretty high. It'll be interesting to see if this is relevant for keys if you're running a plate tank, because that shield could totally save people's lives, right? It's nothing to scoff at for sure. So potential there as a defensive embellishment that actually, you know, maybe works better than Spore Cloak for tanks, but, you know, we'll have to see if that actually gets used. The other one is, I believe, from Council here. Yeah, here it is, Verdant Conduit. So this is like an armor patch, like the Shadow Flame one, or, you know, any of the Toxic patches, whatever. And basically just gives your spells and abilities a chance to proc secondary stats. So this one, I doubt we'll see much use from tanks, but interesting to note nonetheless. Now, let's get into what everyone's been waiting for, Trinkets. I'm going to break this up. I'm going to start with Raid Trinkets, and then we'll move into Mythic Plus Trinkets. So, starting with the Raid Trinkets here, I've organized them a little bit based on, you know, how I feel about them. So, for talking about this Signet brand here, I think this is going to be a very, very powerful single target, so like a raid specific trinket that comes from the raid. This is, you know, based on melee attacks. You kind of stack this up to 15 times, so it's going to be similar to Anvil, where like if you go into longer duration fights where you're able to get this to max stacks and keep it at max stacks and deal damage to the boss for a while, it's going to be very, very valuable. But it comes with a downside that it does deal damage to you, so be aware of that. The one problem with it in Mythic Plus specifically is, unlike Anvil, this is going to decay very, very quickly here. As you see at the bottom, it decays every 5 seconds while out of combat and fades entirely after 15 seconds, where something like Anvil, you could hold an actual use of Anvil to fully extend the proc, giving you 30 seconds out of combat before you would lose any stacks. So I don't think this is going to be super great in Mythic Plus unless you can guarantee you're just chaining the whole dungeon, which I doubt. But I think it'll be quite strong on longer raid fights for sure. In terms of what will be good in Mythic Plus, oops, I equipped it there. We've got a trinket from Farak. This is a very rare trinket from Farak. This is the tank one, basically just passive pulsing damage around you every 3 seconds while you're in combat, notably, so you're not going to break like invis pots or anything like that. And then this is an on-use that's kind of like a split between being a pure defensive one and a pure offensive one. So it doesn't give like the full shield value you would expect from this eye level trinket, and it doesn't do the full damage you would expect from the eye level. It's kind of like a half and half, but combined with that first effect, it actually is a pretty significant amount of damage here. So if anyone remembers like a blood spattered scale type effect, this is kind of what that does. You use it, and it gives you a 10-second absorb shield, but at the same time, you'll deal pulsing damage both to yourself and to nearby enemies every 2 seconds for the entire duration, increasing up to 5 enemies there on a 1.5-minute cooldown. So it's a relatively short cooldown as well. It does give Verse as the main stat, which is a bit of a downside. Tanks really, really like having primary on trinkets, but I do think the effect is actually quite strong. It is, of course, a very rare trinket off the last boss in the raid, so it might be a little bit hard to get, but it seems like a very, very solid option so far, at least for PTR testing in Mythic Plus specifically. Moving on, we've got another very rare trinket from Farak. So for those that don't know, there's actually 3 very rare trinkets from Farak here. Actually, I can open up. I believe the other one is not relevant to tanks. Yeah, there's a healer one here. But this one is DPS and tank players, and this one is actually very, very strong. So basically, you can see here, your crits basically kind of do additional damage when you get this proc up to a certain amount, and increased again based on the number of enemies struck up to 5. This is dealing a ton of damage in Mythic Plus. It was doing quite well even on Raid as well. So I think this is going to be a pretty good pure damage option for tanks. Again, though, you're coming in and you're seeing that crit strike. You're like, would much rather it be agi or strength, but still, in terms of just pure damage output, this is definitely up there in all forms of content for most tank specs for sure. Then we have the Gift of Ursine Vengeance. This is a pretty interesting trinket. It basically just gives you a ton of primary stats. I've been talking like we like primary. This is a lot of primary. It has primary on the trinket. And then you get this stacking buff that goes up to 30 that gives you additional primary per stack, and the stacks are capped at getting 1 every 3 seconds here. And then once you actually get to max caps, you'll be counterattacking, and the healing is pretty much insignificant, but the counterattacking can add up if you're doing a big pull when you actually trigger that effect. So this is probably going to be a more Mythic Plus oriented trinket here in terms of getting that value, but regardless, you're going to be getting a lot of primary even in a raid setting, so something to keep in mind there. But I think this is definitely going to shine more in Mythic Plus, where you can maintain decent stacks and get a good value from that counterattacking as well, and just having so much primary is really, really nice for sure. We of course have to have our little stat stick type trinket this patch. So this is just any Omni trinket, Strength, Intellect, Agi, and basically it's going to be rotating between Mastery, Versatility, and Crit based on your best friend, and you get the ability to kind of proc a big amount of that stat as well for 12 seconds there, and diminishing over that duration. I don't think you'll see a ton of tanks use this. Maybe a nice stopgap. Stats are nice, of course, but usually this is something that you're more going to see on like a DPSer is my guess. We also have some less than stellar looking trinkets from the raid. Cold Serpents. I really wanted this to be good because it looks really cool. You get these snakes that will pop up out of the ground and they shoot stuff, but it's a little unreliable in Mythic Plus. It kind of, you need it to proc the second part of the effect, where if the target dies, deals extra damage to like 8 nearby enemies. That makes it do a lot of damage, but you're basically RNG procking these serpents, and then you're RNG hoping that they get a killing blow, or the target dies rather, not a killing blow. But yeah, too unreliable in my opinion. Probably not something you're gonna use. Ashes of the Ember Soul. This is a haste trinket, has a massive primary proc for 20 seconds, decays over that time, but then you basically are not wearing a trinket for the next minute. Don't think you're going to see a lot of tanks use this. It's more of a burst DPS trinket in my opinion, but something to note because it was bugged pretty much all of PTR, giving way more primary, way more often procs than it should have, and you saw a lot of people maybe using it, but I doubt that's intended behavior. It's not going to work that way on live, so I wouldn't be aiming for this trinket. You've got a couple damage procs ones. So this is a strength only one. This is an agi only one. Both these are kind of meh. They're just on use. This is a 2.5 minute on use. This is a 1.5 minute on use. This one found some maybe use if you're a paladin and you always time this with using your might for the extra crit bonus. But otherwise, both these were fairly mediocre and probably not something that you'll want in the end game, but maybe something that you'll use as like a little gap trinket while you're still trying to hunt for those trinkets you actually want. Those are the raid trinkets. There are some pretty interesting options for sure. Now let's get into Mythic Plus. So this is something I'm sure a lot of people are excited about. The Cheat Death trinket is of course in the Mythic Plus pool, though, and caveat, if you're not doing super high end content, usually Cheat Death trinkets are a bit of a bait, but regardless, there is a Cheat Death trinket available if you want to wear one. So there it is. It's from I believe the first half of the Dawn of the Infinites Mega Dungeon. We also have this 3-minute on use. For the most part, I don't think any tanks are going to want to use this. A 3-minute on use, not too great for most tank specs. I saw maybe there was a Guardian build that doesn't take the Incarnation CDR anymore, so maybe for that specifically, but otherwise, I doubt you're going to see much use out of this trinket for tanks. You've got this stat stick here. I believe they actually increased the budget on this again, because it used to be under budgeted because it had that really bad effect here. The magic damage is a chance to silence an attacker for 2 seconds on a 20-second ICD. I believe they increased the stat scaling, so it's no longer under budgeted, so it just has this little bonus effect that doesn't really do much, but it's there. So again, a nice little gap trinket that you might, get and use for a little bit early on in the season, but probably not something you're going to use in the end game. But hey, if you want a verse stat stick, there it is. This is a pretty interesting defensive option, I think. I think particularly for the block tanks, it's quite strong because you're mitigating so much of the damage up front. This flat damage mitigation on top of that is quite powerful. Less so for a tank like Blood DK, where you're taking pretty big hits up front and just healing it all back. This is not going to be that valuable, but basically pretty much every tank can just maintain 3 stacks of this debuff on the mobs, assuming they're actively hitting them, which is pretty nice here. So potentially a pretty solid defensive option for certain tank specs, not for everyone. And again, you're giving up that primary stat here for crit, so maybe that kind of gets it out of the running, but something to keep in mind defensively. I thought this was pretty good for a couple of the tank specs. Random procs now. There's a Strength and Agi one that can randomly proc haste that increases over duration. Seemed fine. Same Strength and Agi here. This one randomly procs mastery and avoidance. Again, this was just kind of fine. We got some strength specific ones here. So we've got Razan's Eye. This was changed actually. So instead of being a proc of stats, it's now a proc of a raptor. And this was actually doing pretty decently in a single target scenario. So maybe kind of a sleeper option here. The raptors were doing quite a bit of damage in single target. So something to potentially want to look out for strength tanks. You've got a crit proc here. Just, standard crit proc. You've got an on use here, which is potentially nice here. A 2-minute ton of haste, which decays over 20 seconds, strength only again. So potentially interesting if you're pairing it with something. And then you've got a crit trinket that has a 1.5-minute strength proc. Again, probably not going to use that is my guess, but it might be good for damage if you're lining it up with something on a 1.5 CD like wings or something like that, right? Agi only trinkets. Witherbark's branch is actually quite interesting. So it has the downside of it being a bit of a mini game. Right, so basically, this will just shoot out 3 spheres, and they'll just constantly home in on your location, and whenever you touch one, you gain that 10-second mastery buff, and this duration will actually refresh itself too, if you soak them far enough apart. So if you do the whole minigame to its maximum extent, you'll get 10 seconds, or 9 seconds maybe, of the 1700, another 9 seconds of the 3400, and then another 10 seconds of the final one at 5100. So something to keep in mind, but I find it very unlikely, especially as a tank player, that you're going to be able to do that mini game fully if you're tanking mobs. Maybe on a raid boss when you're not actively tanking the boss or something like that could be interesting if mastery is a very good stat for you. Though I'm not sure mastery is actually a really good offensive stat for any of the tanks, so maybe that's a moot point there. Again, Agi only too, so it has to be one of the Agi tanks specifically. But in general, it's still a ton of stats. It's on a 2-minute cooldown here, so if you're able to play the minigame, great. But my guess is you're probably going to see more DPS specs play this. And even then, they might choose not to because the minigame is too annoying to actually do. It's kind of like the Council of Blood trinket where you spin around, if you guys remember that. That one was a bit annoying. On top of this, we've got the Midas Talisman again. Pretty undertuned here, 1.5-minute cooldown, but wasn't doing great damage in my testing either. I think this was pretty bad back in the day as well, so probably not going to be using this too often. And then we just have some really, really bad trinkets for my testing. So Zeratic's Unhatched Egg Sac. This has stamina on it, which is horrendous. This is just the worst thing to ever see on a trinket, stamina. And it's just also defensive on top of that. So yeah, you definitely will be wanting to avoid this trinket at all costs. Insta-delete for sure. The Accelerating Sandglass here. This one maybe was just an issue with the proc rate. It seemed like very, very low. It was not having great uptime. It was not doing a ton of damage from the second effect. So maybe this gets buffed. But at least in my testing, it was definitely like the worst of the random proc trinkets available. So you definitely would prefer like any of these other ones over here, like the Eggshell or the Crab, if you don't mind having some mastery, or one of the damage procs like the Razan's Living Eye, whatever. And then again, we have the spiked counter rate here. So your melee attacks do extra fizz damage and increase the damage the target takes from you up to a certain cap. But again here, the proc kind of okay for tanks, not the best, but it's okay. But it also has haste on it, so potentially something that a decent number of tanks are going to want to avoid. Though haste is not terrible for a couple of the tank specs, so caveat there, right? Paladins like having a lot of haste, prot warriors have it like having a lot of haste, right? So potentially usable there, but the proc was a bit underwhelming compared to other options, which is why it's over here. But yeah, there it is, guys. That's all the cool new tank loot coming in patch 10.2. I'm curious to hear what people think about all the different options this season, the different effects. What are you most excited for? Let me know down in the comments below. As I mentioned earlier, we have a ton of content in the works for the new season, so make sure you are subscribed to the channel with notifications on so you don't miss when those get posted. Big thank you to my subscribers over on Patreon. It really does mean a lot, and I'll see everyone in the next video.